Now that we're on floor framing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the processes of how to lay out joists properly, how to crown your joists, as well as how to install all the joists properly, and a few of the techniques that I use to actually make things go a little bit more efficiently when you're building. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm actually going to use these two plates as the base starting point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually tack two of them together with a hand nail, and I'm going to stand them up on edge, and I'm going to lay out where each joist is going to go. So I stand them up on edge like this. I make sure on the end that they're fully flush. I'm going to take a hand nail, I'm just going to tack it together so that they don't move. So now they're all together. So next what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out for one joist to land on every 16 inches. So typically what we end up doing is we want to make sure that each joist is 16 inches on center. So when I lay this out, the very first one is going to be flush on the end of my plates, just like that. Next, what I want to do is, rather than coming to the 16 and making a line, what I want to do is I want to make sure that the center of the board is over top of the 16, hence why the name 16 inches on center. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back half the thickness of a 2x4, which is what our joists are, and I'm going to make a line on both boards. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark an X to the side of it. And what that's going to do is that's going to tell me that I'm going to line up the edge of my joist with this line, and I'm going to put it on the side that the X is on. Now, as I'm laying this out, notice that there's actually red numbers. All of these red numbers here are the 16-inch center layouts. And that's to help framers lay out plates, lay out pretty much everything in framing. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually marking the 8 feet right on, and I'm gonna mark an X to the back that way. And the reason for that is because this floor is going to be 8 feet long by 8 feet. And what I'm gonna do is I'm also going to cut the joist at the bottom to allow for the size. So coming back to that last layout, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my speed square, and I'm gonna line it up with that layout that I made, and I'm gonna square across the line. So what I did is this speed square has a flange on it, or like creates kind of a T. What I do is I take it and I have it so that it lines up on the edge of the board. It kind of hooks on, stays on like that by itself. And I line it up with my mark, and then I can draw myself a perfectly 90-degree line to the board. And I'm gonna do that for both of them. So what I've done is I've kind of brought all of my material over to where I'm about to start working. That way it allows me to have more hands-on tool, hands-on material time. I'm not wasting time running back and forth carrying material needlessly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the end of my boards like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start crowning all of my boards. And what I mean by that is I'm going to stand it up on edge like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sight down this leading edge here. And what I want to do is I want to see if there's a natural bow upwards or a bow downwards. So this board here, to me, looks like the crown is down. You can actually see it kind of swoop down a little bit when you run your eye down this edge here. So what I want to do is I want to install this board so that the crown is up. And what that allows the floor to do is actually resist weight over time. And what will actually happen is it could potentially flatten this board out, because what will happen is it'll be sitting on the two ends like this, and weight is going to be sitting on the middle, which will push on that crown. Whereas if the crown was down, if the crown was down like that, there's already a sag in this floor, and over time that sag will get larger and larger due to weight being on top of it. So for right now, what I'm doing is I want to make sure that this board is crowned up. So what we can do is we can mark on it with an arrow or some sort of arc to indicate the crown is up. And what I'm going to do is, because I have to still cut these to length, I'm going to lay them on my plates down there, and I'm actually going to crown it all towards one direction. That way I'm doing the same repetitive motion over and over. It eliminates any kind of discrepancies. So I'm standing here, I crown it, I'm going to crown it that direction, and I'm going to lay it near its layout mark all the way down. Now that I've got all of these boards here, what I need to do is I need to cut these so that when they're installed between these two plates, that it'll equal 8 feet. So currently, these 2x4s are already 8 feet. And what I need to do is I need to subtract for this plate and this plate. So looking at it, this 2x4 isn't truly 2 inches wide. It's actually 1.5 inches. So what I need to do is, on this board, I need to subtract by 1.5 inches for the first plate, and then I also need to subtract for another 1.5 inches, which brings me to 93 inches. Now, because I'm cutting with a skill saw, typically what ends up happening is I'm not always going to be making 100% accurate cuts with a skill saw. So in the framing world, this is something that we sometimes do, and we'll actually make this 1/16 to 1/8 smaller than the actual measurement, and that allows us to be a little bit closer to the measurements that we actually want to, because as this goes together, there may be a slight gap here and there, which will actually push us past the 8 feet, and we definitely don't want to be past the 8 feet. So now we're going to be making multiple cuts on our 2x4s with the skill saw. So let's run through a few different tips and tricks on how to actually use this thing quite safely. So with the skill saw, the blade will always be running in a direction like this. So what that means is you always want to be conscious if this ever grabs. So what will end up happening is, if this grabs, it'll always want to come backwards. So when you're always using this, you never want to have your hands anywhere in behind this, just for that reason. So you want to make sure that you're starting the saw blade off of the board just by a little bit. So what I'm doing is one of two things. When I start the saw up, I can actually see through this little hole here where my blade is. And what I'm doing is I'm lining up my skill saw blade with the pencil line. Or what I can do is I can actually lean over it and look directly down at the blade. Now this is really important to make sure that you know what side of the line is your waist side. So for instance, this is the area that I want to cut off. What I've done is I've measured all the way up to this line, and that is my 92 7/8 line. Now, if I were to cut on this side of the line, everything would be perfectly dandy. Now, if I cut on this side of the line, what ends up happening is the blade itself of the skill saw is roughly 1/8 to 1/16 of an inch thick. Now, what ends up happening is the whole thickness of that blade turns a 2x4 into dust. So therefore, we're actually cutting this board 1/16 to 1/8 smaller than we actually need it to be. So, for instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be cutting on the far side of the line. So when I go to cut this, I want to line up the blade with the pencil line on the far side of the line. I'm going to pull it back from the board a little bit, and I'm going to pull the trigger and actually send the board all the way through. And when I send the saw all the way through the board, I want to make sure that it's fully through the board before I let go of the trigger. So now, notice when I was cutting that, I didn't raise the blade, I didn't raise the guard up or anything like that. What I tried to do is I always want to make sure that while the saw is running, I want to make sure that the fence is fully touching the 2x4 below. And it doesn't matter too much because right now, because we're cutting square cuts, but when it comes to doing roofs and angled cuts, what ends up happening is if we have this blade up, what ends up happening is the saw may be flat here, but as soon as it gets to the edge of the board, it starts tipping. And what it does is it bends the blade and it starts binding, and then bad things happen. So once we've cut all of our joists, we're actually ready to start installing the joists to the plate. So in order to do that, you always want to double check if you want to make sure that it's always crown up. Now, because I was very diligent in making sure that I laid out each of these joists the same direction, it should be pretty standard for me to just basically take the joist and roll it to one direction. Now, because this is the very first joist, what I want to make sure is I want to make sure that it's flush on the outside. And what I mean by flush is that they're both in line with each other. One doesn't stick over the edge like that. You want to make sure that it's nice and flush on the end, as well as you want to make sure that it's flush on top. So because I'm using a nail gun for this, there's a few kind of safety tips I want to do about this. Now, in order for me to keep it flush, what I do is I keep all of my fingers way back here, and I use my index finger to hold the 2x4 joist flush with the plate. And what I'll do is I want to make sure that I'm using the bottom of the board to shoot the first nail. So when I'm doing that is I'm allowing the nail to go through this board, and it's going to end up somewhere around here. Now, by some weird circumstance, yes, you possibly can still get hit by this, but there's next to no chance, in the sense that in order for this nail to actually hit my hand, it has to hit something hard in this wood and bend upwards at a ridiculous angle and hit my fingers. So by keeping all of my fingers back here and my one finger above it, I've reduced the risk an extreme amount. To shoot the second nail, I then move my hand back and shoot the second nail on the top. And now I have a board that's perfectly flush on the end as well as on the top. So, if you haven't already noticed, the wood that we're using right now is pressure treated. And the reason why we're using pressure treated is because this wood is always going to be exposed to some sort of moisture. Because there's nothing really stopping any rain, anything from really getting at this. So, by using pressure treated wood, we want to make sure that you're using the appropriate fasteners. So what we're using is galvanized nails, which basically is a normal nail, but it is dipped in zinc coating so that it allows it to resist any kind of moisture. So notice how even though I took off that additional 1/8 of an inch when cutting these joists, when I measure this out, it sits on 8 feet exactly. So it just ends up working out that if you take that little bit off at the beginning, it just helps you in the long run. So next, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm actually going to throw a row of bridging down the middle. Now, bridging is not always necessarily needed in a floor. However, what it does is it allows the floor to kind of tie itself together in the middle and actually resists any kind of bounce in the floor. So what ends up happening is with a joist that stands up like this, as weight pushes down on top of it, what ends up happening is it wants to deflect load. What it wants to do basically is it wants to actually push weight out to the side and actually push the joist sideways. Now, the one thing that we can do is we can actually tie the center of these joists all together using the bridging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out to the center of this joist here, and I'm going to measure out to the center of the joist behind me, and I'm going to snap a line across the top, and that'll allow me to line up a row of blocking to fit in the center of these joists all the way across. So 48 inches, and just to double check that I'm center, 48. Notice how it's a little bit off, so we just go between. So there is the center of my joist right there. Now this is not needed as a tool, however, this is a tool that I end up using quite a bit. Just makes me a little bit more efficient, and it's called a chalk line. So this chalk line allows me to snap straight lines and leave some sort of a mark. So it's actually a dry line with inside this case here, and we fill it with some sort of marking chalk, and it gets on the line as we reel it out, and then we're able to pull it nice and tight, snap it, and it leaves us a marking line for this. So when it comes to cutting the bridging lines, what you want to make sure is you're not going larger than what is actually there. So in order to actually measure out the joists here, I don't want to measure out in the middle, because look at how much I can actually move these joists. I can actually move them quite a bit. So therefore, I'm not getting an accurate measurement at that point. What I want to do is I want to come to where it is a secure point. Whereas right here, because it's nailed here and here, I would consider that a secure point. So if I were to cut a block, I'm measuring 14 1/2. So therefore, I'm going to cut myself a block at 14 3/8. So I go 14 3/8, make my mark, and I just do a little flag because it helps me see. Square my line across. Now, because there's going to be multiple of the same block, what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to create a pattern block using the very first block. So I'll write a P on it so I know not to lose it. Should always double check it before you start using it. 14 3/8. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up flush on the end here. Mark the opposite side. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to the pencil line that I just made, marking the opposite side again. And I can do this pretty efficiently and pretty quickly for multiple blocks. And now what I'm going to do is I'm always going to cut on the same side of the line the whole way. That way all of these blocks that I'm cutting are going to be the same measurement. So this blue line, it's actually going to indicate what side of the block I'm going to do, and I'm actually going to alternate which side of the line I'm going to go the whole way, and that allows me to easily nail straight through into the block. So now that that block's installed on my left of the line, what I'm going to do is now install this one on the right of the line. And you see how I'm able to easily nail straight through the joist into the block every time. So it's always good to just double check, make sure that you're still on the right measurement. So what I've done is I actually went through and I slightly tapped some of the blocks. So if you notice, some of these have slight gaps in them. So because this is bridging, they don't need to be 100% tight. I would say that the largest I would allow this gap to be is about 1/8 of an inch. But all I did is I just went through and made sure that there was kind of an even gap here and there, just to allow for the center of my bridging to equal 8 feet. And the reason for that is because the end of the floor here is 8 feet, so therefore the center should be 8 feet as well. So during this whole frame, I've been using what we call 3 1/4 inch nails. So that means that they're 3 1/4 inches long. Now that's typically that's the size of nail you use anytime you have a wood-to-wood framing contact. So what I mean by that is because I have a 2x4 nailing into a 2x4, those would be considered, to me, wood-to-wood contact. So what I'm going to be doing next is I'm going to be nailing plywood on top of my joist. So because I no longer have like that wood-to-wood contact, I'm not using plywood, I'm switching to 2 1/4 inch nails. And that's pretty standard for any kind of plywood to framing material. As soon as you switch to that plywood, the 3 1/4 inch nails don't really give you much more strength. They actually almost become more of a detriment at that point. So that's why we switched to the 2 1/4s. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to try and square the floor using the sheet of plywood. Typically, I would try and set this floor square before I do the plywood, but because it's a small base, I'm able to try and utilize the plywood itself to help square it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the far corner, the side that I started my layout from, and I'm going to attach that corner and use the leading edge here of the plywood to help straighten that first plate. So I'll show you here. So what I'm doing is, because this sheet of plywood is 8 feet long, the same length as our floor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it perfectly flush on the outside corner here. So not only is it flush here, but it's actually flush on the outside here as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use one nail in the corner there. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run down this entire edge and I'll make sure that it's flush all of the way. Now what I'm trying to do is, I kind of use this as a bit of a nailing guide, is when I'm doing this is I can actually see where the joists are below. So I'm trying to aim for roughly 1 nail every 16 inches along the edge. So as long as I'm kind of keeping a little bit in line with the joist below, that allows me to stay within the 16 inches below. So next what I'm going to do is, once this whole edge is nailed off, I'm actually going to go back to that first side that I started. And I'm going to do the exact same thing, just with the very first joist. What I'm able to do is actually able to pull the floor frame and make sure that the plywood runs flush here. And typically for this, what I'll do is I'll hit the center point and then I'll come to the top, because sometimes these joists can be a little bit bowed one way or another. So once it's fully nailed off like that, around the outsides, I've actually created a perfect 90-degree angle because these sheets are pre-manufactured. They're always cut 100% square. So what I'm doing is I'm really trusting the material to allow me to create a perfectly square structure. When it comes to using plywoods, specific plywood sometimes requires you to always use one side up. So what that means is you always want to have the proper side of the plywood facing away from the structure. Now, a lot of the plywood will actually have stamps on the back of it. Now, this one doesn't actually have anything saying that this side is the back side of the plywood. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to create the same look. So the plywood sheet I just put down, I put all of this stamp down to the joist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same thing to this one, just to make it look uniform. But when it comes to doing your own sheds or own builds, always make sure that you look at the plywood, make sure that it says what side is up. So to continue using the second sheet of plywood to allow us to square this whole floor, what I've done is I nailed the two ends, making sure that the joints in the plywood were nice and tight together. And just to add strength to it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that there's a nail at the edge of each joist. And then I'm going to come back up to the top, and just like before, I'm going to use the edge of the sheet to try and square the rest of the floor, and see how I'm able to still push it slightly to make sure that the edge here is perfectly flush. There you go. Perfect. Then I just have to finish nailing it all off. Okay, so basically by building the frame and putting on these blocks, what I've done is I didn't exactly put these blocks 100% in the right spot. And as you can see, this block here doesn't really sit on the corner, which is what I was aiming for. So what I have to do now is I actually have to try and hand dig and allow me to bring the block over so that it sit in the corner. And I actually did the same thing up there. I need to move the two front blocks just slightly so that they sit in the corner a little bit nicer. And it'll help me allow to level the whole floor out. So now that we've kind of got our structure set in place, what I need to do is I want to make sure that we are leveling the whole surface here. So what I need to do is I actually need to figure out which one of these 4 supports is the high point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my level for that. So when I'm going around, it's always good to double check to make sure that your level is actually perfectly working perfectly. So right now is actually a perfect time to check that. So notice how I have the level sitting, and it's actually, the bubble here is touching that line there. Now, in order to make sure that this thing is still reading accurately, what I can do is I can actually take it and rotate it 180 degrees, make sure I put it back in the exact same location. Now, see how the bubble is still touching that same line exactly? That to me tells me that my level is still reading perfectly. Now, right now, by the bubble leaning to my left, that tells me that this side here is actually higher. And what I can do is I can actually take the level and lift it up until I see that the bubble is perfectly between the lines here. What I'll do is I'll turn it around so you guys can see it a little bit better. So as it's sitting here, the bubble's sitting on the line. If I want to sit here and say, okay, let's see if this side needs to go up. As I lift it, it makes it worse. So I know that in order to make it level, my left here should go down, or the right can go up. So that tells me that this side here is the high point. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to check this side here. I look at it, and again, the bubble is touching one of those lines. You want to make sure, again, that the bubble is perfectly centered, and by lifting up my left side, it's telling me that that same point there is still high. So what happens is I'm going to have to level the whole floor off of this point here. So what I've done is I've actually gone and cut a small block, and I've put it underneath the floor inside the deck block there. And what I've done is I've actually got it now so that the bubble reads perfectly centered between these 2 lines. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the other side, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. So I'm going to sit here, and this is actually good to use an assistant or helper with you. So what I can do here is I can actually use my tape measure. I can lift up and read the tape measure while my assistant can look at the bubble and tell me when it's perfectly centered. And Mitch is going to help me out with that. Tell me when?
About there, yep.
Okay, so I may be reading it wrong, but I see about 7/8 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut myself a 7/8 wedge. So I'm actually going to do what we call a rip cut on this. And the only reason for that is so that the grain of the wood runs side to side. And by doing this, it actually will eliminate, it'll help eliminate the chance of this block here cracking over time. So what I kind of mean about that is I can take this, bend it, it doesn't really break too much, and that is because all of the grain in the wood runs side to side. Whereas if I cut a small block like this, all the grain is actually running up and down, and we can't really see the grain. We actually see the end grain here, and I can actually take and break it. So therefore, that's why I do these ripped cuts, and it just allows this block to be a little bit stronger, and I can actually nail it without having to worry about it breaking. There, perfect.
For the next step in our How to Build a Shed series, you can click the video thumbnail on your screen now, or check the description below for links.